And we did that across 3 rounds. So at the end of it, we were able to report, the statements that reach consensus, how they reach consensus, and most importantly, what we're doing also today, we're disseminating the findings. More broadly, the expected results, first of all, we wanted to test the appropriateness of this method. We wanted to disseminate the results for us to brainstorm and think about it, think if this is a way forward, and finally advocate for the integration of consensus methodology to address a lot of the transparency issue, of the single voice issue representing an entire continent, and allow for structured patient and clinician involvement in HTA process. So ultimately, the main outcome was for patients. First and foremost, as I was saying, have UHTA visibility, understanding better this process, especially for an asset that was coming for them. Being able to generate group inputs, addressing differences across Europe, and finally, engage more actively in the HTA process. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is what it looked like. The criteria that we chose were, each panelist needed to be an active member of an SMA patient community and have experience with patient representativeness. And indeed, later in these numbers, I will discuss what that meant. But you can see we have 12 panelists representing a broad geographic coverage of Europe, and all of them were included across all 3 rounds, so we had no dropout. 100% of the panelists felt somewhat to very comfortable representing the voice of SMA patients. So they felt that they had the representativeness of the patients and caregivers in their country. And I want to specify this difference because it's a key item that drove the results, which we were not expecting at first. So we had a broad range of profiles, including patients, actual patients, and caregivers, and patient experts, right? And we, at the end of it, we understood that more research was needed to untangle some of the differences, but these, consensus brought out the differences in perspective that the different patient profiles have. 100% of panelists were actively involved in PAGS activity, and the vast majority of them, 89% of the panelists, were in constant contact in their country with above 50 patients or caregivers, so between 50 and 200. So we're talking about representatives of active groups. Only 11% were between 5 and 10. None of the patients, of the panelists included, say that they didn't feel representing the voice of their patient community. Can you go to the next slide? Yes. And here we go with the results. So here it's a lot of colors and a lot of numbers. But I don't want to go into too much into the detail also because we don't have the time. And indeed, we have published already the manuscript with the results where we go much more into the detail of this. We have 2 manuscripts, actually. The first one is in the reasoning, and it's an opinion paper. And the second one is the one with the actual results where you have much more details. But what I want to get you to get from this slide is really the build-up of consensus. And I would like you to focus on the green boxes and how they differ between the different PICOS items. Of course, for example, you see that for population, it was quite challenging in the first rounds to get consensus, given the nature of the disease, and we will see a bit later also the characteristics of the product. Was also something indeed that drove the divergence in the intervention characteristics, and similar to comparators. So population and comparator were the one, as expected, that from the very beginning we had more difficulties in reaching consensus because of the language, because of the text, because of the information and the perspective that are quite different. It was different for outcomes and study designs, where we were closer to consensus already in first rounds. But most importantly, I would say the final results, as you can see in the right column of this slide, we were able to reach the vast majority of consensus on the items we actually asked across all the PICOS criteria and PICO items. And I think this speaks to itself to the level of not only negotiation, but understanding that went across the 3 different rounds. Finally, what I want to say is there is not one solution fits all in terms of when you will get consensus for the different items. For some items like population intervention, we got it later, and we had to understand better the details, shape the text of the statements accordingly. For some others, we got it earlier. So it's essential to go through the 3 different rounds to be able to properly bring everybody on board on where we can find consensus, and ultimately also knowledge that somewhere you cannot. So we left it there. If you can go to the next slide, please. Yes, here we go. So what was the consensus we reached? And I don't want to go too much into the detail of this slide again for the same reason as I mentioned earlier. We don't have a lot of time, but here we highlighted key consensus items that were reached. So first and foremost, for the population patients, after quite some adjustments, were able to agree on broader inclusion criteria than just the trial characteristics, and the understanding of, such as, for example, pre-symptomatic patients. The age restriction was seen as a challenge. The trial criteria only indeed are a key starting point, but are not the end point. We also, the patients and caregivers also stress the need to move towards a shared decision making. So we were also asking who should decide who gets these drugs, and indeed the consideration of patient and caregiver personal preferences were a key driver of consensus. So it's a shared decision between physicians, of course, and patient caregivers. And this is a recurring theme. We will see patient preferences to come up often, and here is one of the first ones. Of course, there are also items we didn't get consensus on. These are, for example, motor and respiratory function, but indeed the exclusivity of the trial of inclusion criteria for the identification of the target population. So we couldn't, which goes in the consensus we reached earlier. However, the starting point of trial criteria was one of the key items that we needed to negotiate across the different rounds, right, to find consensus on. For intervention, there were a lot of items there. We have 18 items. That's where a lot of inputs were provided from the patients, of course. And these, we felt it was worth expanding on it because of the healthcare system characteristics and differences. So a lot of the items here focused on how the healthcare system would uptake and deliver this drug, and indeed the need for specialized care, the comprehensive planning, which was there in some countries but not in every country, the caregiver support, as well as management of corticosteroid burden. So we went also into some clinical details, as well as equitable access and patient-centered treatment. So we had quite a lot of items where patients felt, okay, we need these things to be taken into consideration. This sent persistence on the preference for CAR-T, and this also has to do with the nature of the product over other therapeutic modalities, but as well as the administration method, the role of indirect costs. And here you see one of the first differences between caregiver and patients, where patients were really driving the focus on also indirect costs, whereas caregiver were mostly saying, we don't care about it, and therefore we will not able to reach consensus on those items, but it's part of the result, as well as emphasis on individualized decision making. Again, going back to the difference between caregiver and patients. If you can go to the next slide, and I'll try to speed up. I just gave you an example, right? No active in comparators. Again, we agree. There was agreement and consensus on the non-active treatment and the focus on best supportive care, integrating patient and caregiver input in selecting the comparator. Again, going back to the patient preference, and sharing of information. So there was a strong need to say we need simplified information to be able to understand and choose ourselves what is best for us, given the patient characteristics. For outcomes, prioritizing clinical outcomes, this is an item that was very early on already we reached consensus on, also because we did a ranking exercise that we will see in the next slide, where we asked patients and caregivers to rank their preferred outcomes. And this was quickly led us to actually get statements saying, okay, for patients and caregivers, we really want to focus on clinical outcomes, quality of life, and caregiver preferences, patient and caregiver preferences. But most importantly, what came up from the first round, which we did not expect, was a strong consensus on the more sensitive measurement tools needed. And if this exercise would have done much earlier on, such as early bigoscoping, when the company is maybe running the trial, this would have led maybe to some additional instruments or perfecting the instrument, right? Which patients were strongly felt it was needed, such as also doctors. And the trial access across Europe. What we didn't manage to get consensus was, of course, prioritizing maybe survival and motor skills over caregiver quality. And again, here you see the difference between patient and caregiver. Study design, there was broad consensus on study design overall. The need for a more comprehensive package, not only the RCT, goes back to the RCT inclusion criteria, but a focus on RWE to actually grasp healthcare system differences, PROs for patient preferences, and single-arm trials, which were seen as, of course, in this case, a needed, acceptable study design, and broader EU participation. We couldn't find consensus on trial location. Again, this was one of the items that maybe needed further explanation, as well as the willingness to trade off innovation and for stronger evidence. And indeed, if you maybe move to the next slide. Yes, if you move to the next slide, you see the ranking exercises that we did in the first round. So on the left side, we asked patients to rank the outcomes. And what you see is from left to right, the number of first choice versus fifth choice for each of these outcomes. So you see a strong focus on overall survival, of course, across all patients. That led to easy consensus development afterwards. But most interesting, on the right side of the slide, what you can see is a trade-off or ranking of uncertainty. We ask patients to rank how willing are they to trade off uncertainty for speed of access. And this led to very interesting discussions that then fed our qualitative analysis to be able to develop further statements down the line. And generally, patients in this case, because of the availability of other treatments, felt that they were, somewhat moderately. They wanted moderately accessible information, accessible innovation, but with moderate certainty. So across the 4 items, basically from high uncertainty to low uncertainty, they chose the third one overall. But there is some variety, as you can see. And yeah, with that, if you move to the next slide, I will quickly speak about the role of qualitative comments. Here, I will not go into the detail, but for you, if you want to get a feeling of how much the qualitative comments were useful to drive the consensus, I leave it up to here. We are happy to share the slides again later if needed. But yeah, this is to summarize the relevance of qualitative comments and qualitative analysis, especially in first round, to be able to drive consensus down the line. And I think this is my last slide, right? If you go to the next slide. Yes, we want your input again. And with that, after this question, I will leave the floor to Valentina that will guide us a bit through the policy learning. Yeah, I'll just read the question. Maybe, where do you see the highest added value of these methods for HTA and engagement in access? And yeah, you can choose multiple options. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Emanuele. So yeah, we'll give you some time to react, and then we continue with the final part of this presentation.
I still see answers coming in pretty consistently. Let's give it about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll and share the results.
Thank you. So the winner is addressing evidence gaps where data are limited, especially for rare diseases, followed by increasing validity and transparency of stakeholder alignment and engagement, meaning clinicians and patients. And then the third ranked is supporting early stage assessments and evidence generation strategies. Yes, I think this all somehow also aligns with the reasons why we wanted to conduct this study. Maybe we can move on with the next slide. And maybe just to explain, this study was conducted by EPF through European funding from the European Commission with in-kind support from Open Health, who have conducted also all the scientific study behind these results. Next slide, please. And I will share here the key outcomes and somehow the considerations drawing from this study. From a policy point of view, the starting point for us was really how we can reduce the fragmentation of the PCOS, because there was a high risk of having many different inputs from the patient side. And for me personally, as someone promoting patient involvement in HTA for many years, I wanted to avoid the risk of having very diverse inputs from patients coming from the same disease areas, because this somehow would jeopardize the outcomes and maybe also invalidate the input coming from patients. But actually, the outcomes we have received and as seen in this study are that the Delphi study allows for structured consensus building because it enables convergence on core outcomes, treatment preferences, study design, priorities through an iterative unbiased reflection and discussions. It also allowed for cross-European representation. As you know, right now under the HTA regulation, there is an opportunity for patients and caregivers to participate, but one or maximum two usually will be invited to contribute to a JCA or even a joint scientific consultation. And that's quite limiting because it doesn't allow to have the broader perspective of the patient communities. While through these studies, we were able to bring on board profiles coming from different geographies, different profiles, age ranges were taken into account, gender. So we were able to ensure a broader relevance and inclusivity through the qualitative and qualitative inputs. Last but not least, also, as I said, I mean, diverse profiles were taken into account. This also allowed to gain some nuances or how the perspectives from the patient side and the caregiver sides can differ, and what is behind those differences, actually. And also it allowed to have more clarity on divergences and also identifying clearly the areas of disagreements. We were not trying at all costs to identify consensus, but understand where maybe some disagreements could not be addressed. And last but not least, also gain some guidance for future research. We also came to the conclusions that this type of studies can be conducted for a JCA, earlier than a JCA, but also in the context of joint scientific consultations eventually, because there is a lot of content that can be also considered by health technology developers in the early stages of research and medicine development. Next one. I mean, this is just to iterate the key messages that I was mentioning earlier. In stronger and more meaningful patient engagement was not a primary objective at the very beginning of when the study was conceived. I must be honest. My only concern at that moment was just the fragmentation of PCOS. But as we moved on with this exercise, I realized how it can be much more impactful than a traditional way of involving patients. Also, the involvement of patient advocacy groups made a difference in the identification of relevant profiles and ensuring also a constant participation of all participants to the study. We had no withdrawal at all from this group, which was very interesting because also it took us a couple 2-3 months at least to complete the study, and all stayed involved till the very end. And all in all, also contributed to the development of the UHTA infrastructure. Now this study is also being considered for future uptake by assessors and co-assessors. Of course, there are some dilemmas there because we don't know yet whether to do and conduct this study for product or indications. There are uncertainties about the funding scheme because it's unclear who can take on board this responsibility. We are aware that the exercise is time consuming and demanding from this point of view, but we also want to stress the fact that it brings more appropriate representations of profiles. What we think should be included in future consensus building exercises similar to this one, healthcare professionals should stay involved, not only as member of the steering committees, but also joining the Delphi studies themselves. Next one. And here we come to some considerations because you know that the first JCA report was released last week. And of course, we wanted not to miss the opportunity to also bring this to this conversation. What we know so far about the report, about the first JCA, is that one caregiver was invited to contribute and provide patient input. The caregiver could contribute in two stages, in the scoping stage, in the PICO design phase, and in the draft review. This profile was invited to provide input on all the 8 PICOs from a family perspective, and they did so. And we also noticed some other elements, like the fact that according to the caregiver, it should be given more importance to growth, development, long-term safety outcomes. They also felt that there were some evidence gaps in the study report related to health-related quality of life. So that there are several elements, and also looking more and more at the long-term outcomes potentially. So main findings include the fact that there should be a shift focused to quality of survival, including vision, cognition, and growth. As we said, the evidence practice gap due to missing real-world comparators, also access inequalities across EU, and last but not least, the limited transparency on how stakeholder input influenced conclusions. And that's maybe something that as a patient organizations, we keep stressing that should be addressed because we want to see how the patient input can also not just influence, but can inform the reporting. Next one. And this is my final slide. So our considerations here are that if we apply the Delphi panel in this JCA, probably some of the disagreements around the PICOs could have been addressed earlier. And we would have been able to build some consensus on handling individualized comparators. We would have had for sure stronger stakeholder engagement in the evidence generation phase, also bringing some real world evidence. Also, we would have been able to bring independent expert consensus to confirm alignment on the comparator data with the real world practice. So if we brought both clinicians and patients more broadly here, we would have had more robust data. And last but not least, also we would have improved the transparency of this and traceability through an iterative process, also bringing to clearer final conclusions. And this was my last slide. Here we have our final poll. We are asking you, where do you believe this methodology has a potential for joint clinical assessment? And what should happen next? So you can provide a short answer or one or two lines.
I'll leave this
Okay.
one open for about a minute just because it requires a typed response, and then we'll close it out and share the results. All right, everyone,
Yes.
10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to end it, share the results. Can we see the answers or no?
Not yet.
Okay, let's see here. All right, I can see them on my screen, so I'll just read through a few of them. Let's see. We have Pico building, valuable for all JCAs, worth the investment. Patients providing, lived experience for Pico definition, particularly for member states, would be good to have earlier assessment of where consensus can be found. Yes, to estimate parameters of uncertainty. Potential lies in resolving uncertainty and clinical evidence gaps for JCA. Next, stakeholders must co-create a validated protocol to integrate this method formally into the relative effectiveness assessment process. And then we have a few more that I will pull and provide to the speakers afterwards, but I feel like that was a good start.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate all the questions coming in. We will try and answer some where we can. If not, if we can't answer on the call, we will get back to you too afterwards. There's sort of two main themes though coming through the question, and I think I'll ask the group the first one of why are we aiming for consensus, and what do we do when there is no consensus? Either everyone agrees to disagree, or answers are all over, we can't get any answers. And if that is the case, when do we stop with rounds? Why do we not go into round 10, 11, 12?
Maybe I can take this. It's a great point because it's true that we talk often about trying to get consensus and try to develop this consensus. But it's true that it's not always the case because sometimes identifying areas of non-consensus is equally important. So it really depends, like the topic that we are researching, and for how to manage, like when we are not seeing the consensus that maybe we were expecting. So as we were saying before, like sometimes the rounds for practical reasons are predetermined. We cannot like keep the panelists for in numerous rounds of surveys, so most of the time are like limited to two or three rounds. But another very important aspect to look at is the stability of responses. So instead of looking at whether we reach a certain amount of consensus, we look at the point where panelist answer actually doesn't change over the rounds. So we see the stability of their responses, and then we understand that all panelists have just provided their final answers.
Yeah, and
Right.
I would like to add that dissent in itself is a great result, especially for understanding the need of additional evidence and divergence between different profiles, such as the caregiver and patient, which we were not expecting at first to have such divergent views. But this is also part of the information of why we're doing this exercise. If you think that the opposite would be just to engage one single expert that should speak for the whole community, I think this provides a bit more detail and information in the actual analysis process. And the iteration, as Adele was saying, is key. Being informed on the group response without, being biased. Both, I saw the question on confirmation bias, but also other type of biases is a key item. And of course, we're still talking about a mixed method research, right? So yeah, I will stop there for now. But yeah.
Thank you both. So the other question and theme that's coming through is panel size and sort of the scales to be used. So there's questions on, could we use more binary scales, use a 7 rather than 5-point Likert, and also the main one is what size of panel should we aim for?
Well,
Shall I start or please, Emanuele, go ahead.
No, go. It's fine. No problem.
No, I mean the size. It is a very recurrent question. So, what's the optimal size? Again, it goes back to the research topic. So, if it's a very narrow technical consents that we're looking at, normally smaller samples are fine. Smaller sample of specialized experts, and we're talking about maybe 10, 20 experts, then normally are enough. If the topic that we're looking at it's broader, it's, for instance, we're looking at broader policy alignment, then larger samples are needed. Obviously, the more stakeholders we are engaging, the bigger the panel has to be, because the something that's very important is definitely the balance of stakeholder presence within a panel, so that each stakeholder groups carries the same weight within the generation of the results. And this was about the panel size. I don't know, Emanuele, if you had anything you wanted to add on this.
No, that indeed. I mean, what we have at the moment that you mentioned are the reporting guidelines. We don't have methodological guidelines that are fully, endorsed. The reporting guidelines explain, as you are saying, a clear reasoning behind the number of panelists. So why are you covering? So first of all, which type of profile you want to cover? You need to consider geographic scope, baseline characteristics of the profiles you want to cover, and how these items, drive your number. This is the reason. This is what the reporting guidelines tell us. It's not how do you calculate, because if you want to get consensus, of course, on every heart disease patient in Europe, you can go for a super high number because it's a super generic profile. But if you want, as we were, people that could represent the entire community, then you go for a smaller number because that's something very specific you're looking for, right? It might also be seen as an excuse to reduce the number, but the management of the Delphi group is an essential item, especially with qualitative inputs and one-on-one interviews. Having super large group doesn't bring you anywhere but a statistical analysis, which is just a bit more than a survey, of course, also with controlled rounds. Therefore, the balance between these two items is key. The important thing that the reporting guidelines tell us is to explain the reasoning. And I've seen some publication being listed on the calculation. There are recent scoping reviews as well as narrative review that go and look at what was done so far in terms of consensus. You will see that alone lands something between 8 and 20 for many of the disease areas, many of the groups, and then you will see also larger sample sizes. Different rounds. Again, we don't have a methodological guideline. Maybe that's needed, something endorsed, but as long as universities or authorities don't bring that level required, we will not get there. I think we're getting there with the methodological, with the reporting guidelines, but that's just on the reasoning and explaining why. A lot of the papers don't even explain why, and that's a big mistake, I think.
Just because we're getting at time, I'll answer one question myself because it'll be a quick answer of, is IRB review required? Maybe. Please do check. IRBs will happily tell you if it's not required. There can be guidelines on their website, but do always check. It is not always required, but you need to confirm that one. On that, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I believe when you registered, if you selected that, you'd be happy for those to opt into communications will receive the slide and questions as well. There's so many questions. Thank you for submitting them all. I know we've not been able to answer them all. We will answer them where we can when we sort of get in contact with you, and feel free to contact us as well. Have a fantastic rest of the day and week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your time and attention today, and thank you to our panelists for their time and expertise as well. As mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, it was recorded and will be sent via email to all registered attendees in approximately 2 business days, as well as posted on the ISPOR webinar series webpage. Additionally, there will be an email provided for any unanswered questions that you might have. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.